Hello! Okay, this is going to be the first of two videos, where in this first video I introduce my preferred definition of veganism, explain why I think it's the best one for advocacy, then in the second video run you through 5 amazing arguments for veganism and how best to argue for it. This is mainly for vegans to become better skilled at advocating, but any feedback is more than welcome. So, how to explain what veganism is. I define veganism as simply an animal products boycott. I make the point of saying it's one campaign tactic among many, aimed primarily at achieving the end of animal agriculture. And that personally, I see the principle behind the action as being grounded in the animal rights movement, seeking collective legal rights for animals to have a refuge in dense wildlife habitat where they aren't subject to human cruelty. In a similar way to how the act of boycotting South African products, or the act of boycotting the Montgomery Bus Company, was grounded in a larger civil rights movement. Other boycotts didn't have a specific name for the identity one took on when boycotting. The principle for why they boycotted was contained in what it meant to be part of a larger movement, for example, being a civil rights advocate. So I would just encourage people to think of themselves as animal rights advocates first, fighting for the legal protection of animals, though you could also call yourself an animal liberation advocate, fighting to free non-human animals to be able to express their capabilities in managed wildlife habitat or a sanctuary. Excuse my dog. As for why someone would arrive at the ethical conclusion to boycott, it could be a million ways. You just need to tailor your arguments to the person you're standing in front of, as we'll discuss in the second video. It's not important for you to know the school of philosophy you're arguing from, but I'll give you them anyway as an introduction to each ethical argument for an animal products boycott. So, 5 ways to explain the principle that got you into veganism, and what branch of philosophy it may be related to. Firstly, hedonistic utilitarianism. The principle of not breeding sentient life into the world, where you know you will cause more suffering on a global calculus than happiness. Some examples of harms you are attempting to limit or avoid could include climate change, stress and pain for the animals in a slaughterhouse than longer happy life in the wild with low rates of predation for large mammals. Stress to slaughterhouse workers who are more likely to abuse their family. And secondly, preference consequentialism. The principle of not breeding sentient life into the world to kill when you know they will have interest to go on living longer than would be profitable. Examples could include they have habits for things they'd like to do each day, and they show you by their desire not to be loaded onto scary trucks and to a slaughterhouse with screams and smells of death. And thirdly, my favourite, virtue ethics. The principle of not breeding a sentient life into captivity when you know you could leave room for other animals to enjoy happy flourishing, being able to express all their capabilities in wild habitat. So, not wanting to parasitically take away life with meaning for low-order pleasure in our hierarchy of needs, which we can find elsewhere. And fourthly, deontology. The principle of everyone should only act in such a way that it would still be acceptable to them if it were to become universal law. So, not breeding sentient life into existence only to keep them confined, tear families apart and kill them later, as you wouldn't want it to happen to you. Finally, nihilist meta-ethics. The principle that you should be wary of inauthentically acting in a way you don't believe due to outside social pressures. Like that acting uncaringly is necessary to what it means to be a man. So, testing out values you were brought up with against new ones as you go, and coming to the conclusion that you prefer a society where most have the value of seeing animals flourishing in nature and not in captivity or pain. And so, why not use other definitions? The reason I would encourage people to use the definition an animal products boycott and not other definitions is it gets at the root motivation people have for being vegan, without being divisive about which ethical system is best. In 1944, those members of the Vegetarian Society who were avoiding all use of animal products created their own vegan society and came up with the word vegan. They did this after a series of debates in which they voiced their concern that we should also be advocating the boycott of the dairy and egg industries. Now, I acknowledge that one problem with defining veganism as an animal products boycott is people's intuition that when they say well, would you be okay with hunting wild animals yourself then? But to that I would answer, implicit in the word boycott is an ethical judgment on the activity that creates the product. So when I boycott animal products across the board because of every aspect of the process that goes into making that product, such as breeding, captivity, and or killing, it wouldn't suddenly be okay for me to then go out and do the killing myself just because I didn't sell the meat on. You can't desire that all commercial use of animal products stop existing in the world through a commercial boycott, and also do an action which, through your boycotting, hope to prevent the incentive for it ever happening. Another concern people may have is that boycotting sounds like you're primarily negatively opposed to a thing and just trying to reduce your reliance on that thing. But I would argue you have that with every definition, and that by creating a distance between the behaviour, veganism, and the principle, animal rights, you allow people to see the action as part of a big tent animal rights movement, where you're hoping through the tactics of boycotting, lobbying, starting vegan cafes, food not bomb stalls, and even foraging groups, to create the breathing room necessary for legislation and rewilding, where you can get to enjoy a more compassionate local community and see more animals flourishing in wildlife habitat. To draw attention away from veganism as a political act is to make veganism look simply like an identity one takes on to look cool or be part of a subculture. Whereas people can relate boycotts to other real-world events as great positive coming together moments under a liberation politics. For example, car sharing during the Montgomery bus boycott, students leading the call to stop subsidising Israel, and before that South Africa. The widespread boycotting of a reactionary tabloid newspaper in the UK that ran stories saying mass suffocation at a football stadium due to overcrowding in fences were the fans' fault. So, boycotting to show your real felt ties to the land you stand on. The first boycott was simply with people withdrawing their labour from an imperialist landlord in Ireland, in a desire to build something greater once he'd left. So I think it is very flexible to positive intention. Now, finally, does this definition leave room for any exceptions to the rule? Well, yes, in a way, but I would say a positive one, in that it allows for waste animal products to be used if no profit finds its way back to the person who caused the harm. If you can get a supermarket to redirect its 1,000 loaves of bread containing whey from going in the dumpster to a food bank, that could only be a benefit to the world. Also, it doesn't attempt to include animal entertainment boycotts in what it means to be vegan, and simply leaves that to be included in what it means to be an animal rights advocate. Although it's so similar, one could raise an eyebrow about why someone would boycott animal agriculture and not animal cruelty as entertainment. People already view veganism as simply abstaining from the use of animal products, so we just do have to contend with why awful people like some eco-fascists desire to be vegans and denounce them separately. To try and pretend that someone boycotting animal products can't also be an awful person in other ways is willfully ignorant. In the same way that claiming ex-vegans could never have been vegan for not having understood the ethical arguments is fallacious and off-putting. So what specifically is wrong with other definitions? Why not define veganism as reducing suffering, which is the consequentialist reason for being vegan? Well, because reducing suffering is too big, too abstract, too idealistic, beyond the capacity of one person to ever achieve. Laudable maybe, but doomed to failure. Whereas boycotting animal products is not. Reducing suffering creates the impression of the martyr, the need to live a ridiculously Puritan lifestyle, like Jain monks sweeping the floor everywhere they walk, and excludes all other ethical systems. So why not define veganism as the rule that man should not exploit animal, which is the deontological reason for being vegan? Well, I'd say because it immediately brings to mind the plenty of ways we can pragmatically rescue animals and improve their circumstances, while still less obviously, but still exploitatively, keeping them captive. For example, rescuing dogs, chickens or horses. And again, excludes all other ethical systems. The debates that led up to the creation of the Vegan Society even were about the dairy industry. They were raised equally from a concern about well-being and about rights. Again, Dr. Anne Bonus Kingford, a member of the Vegetarian Society in 1944, argued for a total boycott of animal products, saying, "The dairy industry, quote, must involve some slaughter, I think, and some suffering for the cows and calves." So, why not define veganism as a hodgepodge of the two main ethical systems, consequentialism and deontology? as the modern vegan society tries to do? Well, because it's far too convoluted and open to misinterpretation. You get into debates about what does as far as is possible and practical mean, when you could just say veganism is a boycott. If you aren't capable of participating for being eating disordered, for example, that's okay. You can be ethically on par with or more ethical than a vegan in your own way, but you just aren't able to participate in the boycott. So, in summary, I'll go over what I think are the best definitions. Firstly, what is veganism? Well, 1, an animal products boycott. This is a minimal behavioural commitment with very little confusion about what it entails. The idea that it's a protest allows for other priorities to override the idea, like the need to take vaccines with egg product in them. But either way, it's still a strong commitment to a commercial boycott. It's both the reason the vegan society was created and simply the colloquial understanding of a vegan as a person who does not eat or use animal products, but leaves room for veganism. And or 2, a way of living which seeks to exclude all use of animals for food, clothing or any other purpose. This includes other boycott behaviours like avoiding animals in entertainment, but is vague about whether it entails a weaker or stronger commitment to the act of boycotting itself. Potentially we could move to solely this one definition when we can afford to give more or less equal focus to campaigning against other industries. So what is animal rights? The philosophy which says animals should be granted collective legal rights to have a refuge in dense wildlife habitat where they aren't subject to human cruelty, with the few exceptions where the law is overridden by right to self-defense or special dispensation from the government, for example, to practice some scientific testing to cure diseases, as well as breed and keep guide dogs for the blind, maybe. So if a fox kills a rabbit because it's the only way it can stay strong and pass on its genes, it's part of a wonderfully delicate ecosystem. I have the choice to pick an apple off a tree and enjoy watching the rabbit. So not wanting to parasitically take away life with instinctual desires to express their high-order capabilities for low-order pleasure in our hierarchy of needs, which we can find elsewhere. Finally, what is the animal rights movement? So I'd just say more or less the same again, just swapping philosophy for social movement. So a social movement which seeks to gain collective legal rights for animals to have a refuge in dense wildlife habitat where they aren't subject to human cruelty, with all the provisos again, etc., etc. So that's the end of the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment down below. All the best. Peace.